A sheriff disappeared just 3 weeks after opening a chained black book, and the last thing his body camera recorded has never been explained. This story is inspired by mysterious online accounts. Some names and details have been changed for storytelling purposes. In October 2024, a sheriff's deputy near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, unlocked an abandoned mailbox that had not been opened for nearly 30 years. Inside was a single object, a black leather book wrapped tightly in rusted chains. On the first page, someone had written, "Whoever opens this book has already been chosen." 3 weeks later, the deputy vanished without a trace. His patrol car was found abandoned on a dirt road. His body camera was still recording, but there was no sign of him. Most people believe black magic exists only in movies and urban legends. That's exactly what Ethan Carter believed. At 32 years old, Ethan was a former U.S. Army mechanic who now worked as an electrician throughout rural Louisiana. He trusted facts, science, and logic. Whenever someone mentioned curses, haunted houses, or demons, he always laughed and said, "If I can't measure it, it isn't real." Those words would become the biggest mistake of his life. Everything began on a cold Thursday afternoon. Ethan received a work order from the county to restore electricity in an old farmhouse outside a forgotten community called Cypress Hollow. It sounded like an easy job. A few hours of work, easy money. As he drove toward the property, his GPS suddenly began acting strangely. The map disappeared. The screen froze. Then the navigation repeated the same warning over and over. "Turn around. Turn around. Turn around." A few seconds later, the device shut itself off. No signal, no map, nothing. When Ethan finally reached the farmhouse, the place looked abandoned for decades. The paint had almost disappeared. Broken windows were covered with wooden boards. An old swing on the front porch moved gently back and forth. The strange thing was, there wasn't even a breeze. Ethan stepped out of his truck. Immediately, he noticed something disturbing. The silence. No birds, no insects, no barking dogs, nothing. It was so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat. As he grabbed his toolbox, an elderly woman appeared across the road. She stared at the farmhouse for several seconds before looking directly at Ethan. In a trembling voice, she whispered, "Don't stay after sunset." Ethan smiled politely. "Why?" The woman didn't answer. She simply crossed herself, turned around and walked away as quickly as she could. Inside the farmhouse, thick layers of dust covered every surface. Furniture remained exactly where someone had left it years ago. Dinner plates still sat on the dining table. A grandfather clock stood silently in the hallway. Its hands had stopped at exactly 3:33. Ethan shook his head. "Creepy," he muttered. He opened the basement door. A freezing gust of air rushed upward. That made no sense. The electricity had been disconnected for years. There shouldn't have been any ventilation. Using his flashlight, Ethan slowly walked down the wooden stairs. The basement walls were covered with strange symbols carved deeply into the concrete. Not painted, carved, as if someone had spent weeks cutting them into the walls. In the middle of the basement sat an old iron chest wrapped in heavy chains. There was no lock, only chains, almost as if someone wanted to slow down whoever tried to open it. Curiosity got the better of him. Ethan removed the chains. Inside the chest, there was no money, no jewelry, no family photographs, only a black leather book. Unlike everything else in the basement, the book looked brand new. Not a single scratch, not a speck of dust. The moment Ethan touched it, his flashlight flickered. Once, twice, then every light inside the farmhouse suddenly turned on. For 3 seconds, the entire house was brightly illuminated. Then, everything went dark again. Ethan looked toward the electrical panel. Every breaker was still switched off. His breathing became heavier. For the first time that day, he felt real fear. Then he heard footsteps, slow, heavy, walking across the floor directly above him. He called out, "Hello?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. A child's voice whispered from directly behind him. "You weren't supposed to touch it." Ethan spun around. No one was there. The basement was completely empty, except the black book was now open. He was certain he had never opened it. As he stared at the first page, dark ink slowly appeared by itself, letter by letter, as though an invisible hand was writing in real time. The message read, "Welcome home, Ethan." Ethan had never been to Cypress Hollow before. So, how did the book already know his name? Ethan stared at the words on the page. "Welcome home, Ethan." His heart pounded so hard he could hear it echoing through the basement. "This isn't funny," he said, forcing a nervous laugh. "There has to be a projector, hidden cameras, something." He searched every corner of the basement. Nothing. No wires, no speakers, no hidden devices, just the old iron chest. the strange symbols, and the black book. Then the pages began turning by themselves, slowly, one page after another, until they stopped on a faded drawing of the farmhouse. But something was different. In the picture, a man stood on the front porch. The man looked exactly like Ethan. Same face, same jacket, same work boots. Except his eyes were completely black. Ethan slammed the book shut. "I'm done." He grabbed his toolbox and hurried toward the stairs. But halfway up, he froze. The basement door was gone. Only a solid concrete wall remained. "No!" He ran to where the door had been. There was nothing. He punched the wall, kicked it. Nothing moved. His breathing became faster. Then, his phone vibrated. One bar of signal. A single text message arrived. It was from an unknown number. "Don't look behind you." Ethan's entire body went cold, slowly, very slowly. He turned around anyway. The basement was empty. He sighed with relief. Then he noticed something. His own shadow wasn't moving with him. It stood completely still. Even though he had already turned, his shadow slowly lifted one arm and pointed toward the black book. Ethan blinked. Everything returned to normal. His shadow matched his movements again. He stepped backward. "This place is messing with my head." Suddenly, the concrete wall behind him cracked. The basement door appeared again, as if it had never disappeared. Without thinking twice, Ethan sprinted upstairs. He ran outside, jumped into his truck, and drove away. He didn't even finish the job. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the black book. At exactly 3:33 a.m., his bedroom lights turned on by themselves. His television switched to static. Then a woman's voice whispered through the speakers, "Bring it back." The TV shut off. Silence. The next morning, Ethan convinced himself it had all been stress, until he looked in the back of his truck. The black book was there. He was certain he had left it inside the basement, yet somehow it had come home with him. Desperate for answers, Ethan visited the town library. The oldest librarian frowned the moment she saw a photo of the farmhouse. "You shouldn't be asking about that place," Ethan insisted. After a long silence, she unlocked a cabinet marked Local History. Inside was a newspaper from October 1978. The headline read, "9 members of the Hollow family vanished during midnight ritual. No bodies were ever found." The sheriff's report claimed the family had disappeared without explanation, but the townspeople believed something else. According to local legend, the Hollow family practiced forbidden rituals. They believed they could trade human souls for knowledge, wealth, and long life. The ritual required a special object, a black leather book. Nobody knew where the book came from. Some claimed it had existed long before the town itself. Others believed it wasn't written by human hands. The librarian looked Ethan directly in the eyes. "That book doesn't choose people by accident." "What do you mean?" "It only returns to someone whose blood is connected to Cypress Hollow." Ethan laughed. "My family has never lived here." The old woman slowly slid another document across the table, an old birth certificate. His smile disappeared. The certificate belonged to his late grandmother. Place of birth, Cypress Hollow, Louisiana. His hands began shaking. His grandmother had always claimed she was born in Texas. She had lied, which meant his family had been connected to this town all along. As Ethan left the library, his phone rang. It was his younger sister, Emily. "Ethan," her voice trembled. "Someone has been standing outside my house since sunset." "What?" "They're not moving. They're just watching." "Call the police." I did. They said nobody is outside." Emily began crying. Then she whispered, "Ethan, I think they're inside the house now." The call suddenly ended. At that exact moment, the black book, sitting on the passenger seat beside Ethan, opened by itself. A new sentence slowly appeared across the page. "The debt has awakened." Ethan stared at the words appearing on the page. "The debt has awakened." His hands trembled. He immediately called Emily back. No answer. Again. No answer. Again. Straight to voicemail. Without wasting another second, Ethan slammed the truck into gear and sped toward his sister's house. The entire drive, he had the strange feeling that another car was following him. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, its headlights disappeared, but seconds later, they returned, always the same distance behind him. When Ethan finally reached Emily's neighborhood, every streetlight was on, except one, the light directly in front of Emily's house. It flickered slowly. On, off, on, off. Her front door stood wide open. "Ethan," he shouted as he ran inside. No answer. The living room was empty. The television was still on. A cup of coffee sat on the table, still warm, as if someone had been there only moments ago. Then, he heard a soft humming sound upstairs. It was Emily's favorite childhood lullaby. He rushed toward the bedroom. The room was empty, but the humming continued, coming from the closet. Slowly, he reached for the handle. His heart pounded. He pulled the door open. Inside, no one. Only a large mirror leaning against the back wall. Then Ethan noticed something impossible. The reflection inside the mirror wasn't copying him. His reflection was standing perfectly still, smiling. Ethan wasn't smiling. The reflection slowly raised one finger, pointing behind him. A cold breath touched the back of Ethan's neck. He spun around. Nothing. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection was normal again. Then his phone buzzed. A text message from Emily. Just 3 words. "Don't trust mirrors." The message had been sent 5 minutes after she had disappeared. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They searched every room, every window, every inch of the property. There was no sign of forced entry. No fingerprints. No blood. No footprints. Nothing. One officer quietly pulled Ethan aside. "You're the last person she spoke to." The question wasn't spoken, but Ethan understood it. They suspected him. He couldn't tell them about the book. Who would believe him? That night, Ethan returned home. The black book lay on his kitchen table. He was certain he had locked it inside his truck. Slowly, the cover opened by itself. Another page turned. This time, there was a family tree. At the top, the Hollow family. Below that, his grandmother's name. Then his mother's. Then his own, written in fresh black ink, under Ethan's name. There was an empty space, as if another name was waiting to be added. Suddenly, a single drop of blood fell onto the page. Ethan looked at his hand. A small cut had appeared across his thumb. He had no idea how. The blood spread across the paper by itself. The page absorbed it instantly. Then another sentence appeared. "One has been taken. 2 remain." The room instantly became freezing cold. Every light in the house went out. The only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock. Tick, tick, tick. Then, the ticking stopped. A voice whispered from somewhere inside the darkness. "You should never have opened me." Ethan grabbed a flashlight. Its beam shook violently as he searched the room. Nobody. Then, the flashlight landed on the hallway. Someone was standing there, a tall figure wearing a long black coat. Its face was completely hidden. It didn't move. It simply watched him. Ethan shouted, "Who are you?" No answer. He took one step forward. The figure disappeared. But on the wall behind where it had been standing, 3 words were written in dripping black letters. "Return the book." Before Ethan could react, a loud knock echoed through the house. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. He looked through the peephole. No one. He opened the door anyway. A small cardboard box sat on the porch. No address, no postage, no return label. Inside the box was an old VHS tape. A handwritten label read, "Cypress Hollow, October 31st, 1978. Ethan stared at the tape. He knew exactly what date it was, the night the entire Hollow family disappeared. And somehow, someone wanted him to watch what really happened. Ethan stared at the old VHS tape for several minutes. The label read, "Cypress Hollow, October 31st, 1978. His hands shook as he searched through boxes in his garage. Buried beneath old tools and military gear, he found an old VHS player. He connected it to a small television. The tape slid inside. For a few seconds, nothing. Only static. Then, the picture slowly appeared. The timestamp read, October 31st, 1978. 11:57 p.m. The camera showed the basement of the same farmhouse. 12 people stood in a circle wearing black robes. Candles surrounded a stone altar. In the center sat the same black leather book. A man's voice echoed through the recording. "Tonight, the gate will finally open." The group began chanting in a language Ethan had never heard. The room grew darker. The candles burned with black flames. Then, something impossible happened. The camera suddenly shook, not because the cameraman moved, but because the entire basement was vibrating. A deep growl filled the room. One by one, every person stopped chanting. They were staring at the book. The pages were turning by themselves. Then, a thick black smoke began rising from the center of the book. It wasn't drifting toward the ceiling. It moved, like it was alive. The smoke slowly took the shape of a tall human figure. No face, no eyes, only darkness. The cameraman whispered, "Dear God." The figure raised one hand. Every candle went out. The screen turned completely black. For nearly 10 seconds, but nothing could be seen. Only screams, terrified screams, people begging, crying, running. Then, silence. The picture returned. The basement was empty. Every person had vanished. Only the black book remained. The recording ended. Ethan sat frozen. He finally understood. The Hollow family hadn't disappeared. They had been taken. The book wasn't cursed. It was a doorway. A doorway that demanded blood from the same family, generation after generation. Then Ethan remembered the words written inside the book. One has been taken. Two remain. Emily was the first. That meant someone else in his family was next. Suddenly his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered. There was no voice, only heavy breathing. Then a whisper. The gate opens before sunrise. The call ended. At that exact moment, every light inside Ethan's house exploded. Glass shattered across the floor. The black book opened on its own. Its pages flipped wildly until they stopped on the final page. There was only one sentence. A soul may close the gate, but only if it enters willingly. Ethan finally understood what had to be done, just before dawn. He drove back to the farmhouse. The front door slowly opened by itself, as if the house had been waiting for him. The basement looked exactly like it had in the tape, except now, Emily stood inside the ritual circle. She wasn't moving, her eyes were completely black. Behind her, the same shadow figure slowly emerged from the darkness. Its voice sounded like dozens of people speaking at once. "Your blood opened the gate. Your blood must close it." Ethan looked at his sister, then at the book. Without another word, he picked it up. The figure smiled. Or at least, it looked like it smiled. Ethan whispered, "This ends with me." He stepped into the center of the ritual circle. The symbols carved into the floor suddenly began glowing. The entire basement shook violently. A deafening scream echoed through the house. The shadow reached toward Ethan, but instead of running, he threw the black book into the burning ritual circle. The book burst into black flames. The shadow creature let out a horrifying roar. The walls cracked. The ceiling collapsed. The symbols shattered into dust. A blinding white light filled the basement. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was lying outside the farmhouse. Firefighters surrounded the property. The house had completely burned to the ground. Emily was alive. Unconscious, but alive. The sheriff told Ethan they had found only one thing inside the ruins: a pile of black ashes. No book, no symbols, no basement, nothing. The nightmare was finally over, or so Ethan believed. 6 months later, a retired antique dealer in Portland, Oregon, purchased an old wooden box at an estate auction. Inside, wrapped in rusted chains, was a black leather book that looked brand new. He smiled and whispered, "Wonder what this is worth." He opened the first page. Fresh black ink slowly appeared. "Welcome home."